Previously in Shadows of the South.
Late at night, meeting a stranger, expression never changes, smile violent happens, deeply wrong.
There are encounters that remain disturbing not because something violent happens, but because nothing does. Some people describe meeting a stranger late at night whose expression never changes, whose movements seem slightly out of rhythm, and whose smile appears fixed in a way that feels less like friendliness and more like a signal that something is deeply wrong. They call it the smiling man.
Shadows of the South.
Among modern urban legends, few stories evoke such immediate discomfort as the encounter commonly referred to as the smiling man. Unlike creatures associated with physical aggression or supernatural transformation, this figure is unsettling precisely because of how close he appears to ordinary human behavior, while simultaneously displaying subtle abnormalities that create an almost instinctive sense of unease. Reports describing the smiling man often emphasize the absence of explicit threat, yet the psychological tension generated by the encounter tends to linger long after the event concludes, suggesting that fear does not always require visible danger in order to leave a lasting impression. The story gained attention through personal accounts shared online, particularly one widely circulated narrative describing a late-night walk interrupted by the appearance of a tall man whose expression seemed unnaturally fixed in a broad smile. According to the description, the figure moved with deliberate slowness, maintaining visual awareness of the observer without speaking or directly initiating interaction. The simplicity of the scenario contributes to its effectiveness, as the setting involves an environment that would typically be considered safe, transforming familiarity into a source of uncertainty. Encounters associated with the smiling man frequently occur in urban spaces, characterized by reduced activity, such as empty sidewalks, quiet residential streets, or transitional areas between commercial and residential zones. These locations often produce an atmosphere of partial isolation without complete absence of environmental structure, allowing the observer to perceive the surroundings clearly, while simultaneously recognizing the unusual nature of the interaction. The contrast between ordinary setting and abnormal behavior intensifies the emotional response, reinforcing the perception that the event cannot be easily categorized as either entirely mundane or overtly extraordinary. The most widely referenced account describes an individual walking alone during late-night hours, when environmental stimuli are limited and attention naturally becomes more sensitive to irregular patterns. As the observer proceeds along the street, the presence of another person initially appears unremarkable, as encountering strangers in public spaces typically does not generate immediate concern. However, the narrative emphasizes the gradual realization that something about the figure's movement seems inconsistent with expected behavioral patterns. Witnesses often describe the smiling man as tall and thin, dressed in clothing that appears ordinary yet slightly outdated in style, contributing to a subtle sense of displacement within the contemporary environment. The defining characteristic, however, is the expression itself. The smile is not described as exaggerated in a theatrical sense, but rather as persistent and unwavering, lacking the micro-expressions that typically accompany genuine emotional communication. The absence of variation within the facial expression produces the impression that the smile functions as a mask rather than a reflection of internal emotional state. As the distance between observer and stranger decreases, the individual becomes aware that the figure is not simply walking randomly, but adjusting movement patterns in a manner that suggests intentional awareness of the observer's presence. Some descriptions mention unusual body posture, with movements appearing controlled yet slightly exaggerated, as though the figure is consciously imitating natural human motion rather than performing it instinctively. The resulting impression can create cognitive dissonance, as the observer recognizes familiar physical structure combined with behavioral signals that do not align with typical social interaction. From a psychological perspective, the smiling man narrative demonstrates how ambiguity can produce stronger emotional responses than clearly defined threats. Human perception relies heavily on pattern recognition to evaluate environmental safety, allowing individuals to interpret social cues rapidly based on facial expression, body language, and contextual consistency. When these cues appear distorted or incomplete, the cognitive system must allocate additional resources to interpretation, prolonging attention and increasing emotional arousal. The fixed smile described in many accounts disrupts expectations associated with authentic emotional communication. Genuine expressions typically involve subtle muscular changes reflecting internal emotional states, providing feedback that allows observers to infer intention. When an expression appears static, the observer may experience difficulty predicting behavior, resulting in heightened vigilance. This response reflects adaptive mechanisms designed to prioritize detection of potential threats in situations where available information is insufficient to ensure safety. The slow and deliberate movements attributed to the smiling man further intensify the interpretive challenge. Movement patterns that appear slightly exaggerated or rhythmically inconsistent can trigger awareness that something deviates from learned expectations of human motion. Although the deviation may be minor, the accumulation of subtle irregularities can produce a sense of unease disproportionate to the apparent harmlessness of the situation. The narrative's effectiveness lies in its reliance on minimal deviation from normality, illustrating how small inconsistencies can generate substantial psychological impact. The figure of the smiling man may also function as a symbolic representation of social uncertainty, reflecting concerns related to authenticity and hidden intention within modern environments, characterized by frequent interaction with unfamiliar individuals. The fixed smile can be interpreted as an exaggeration of social expectations, requiring individuals to present controlled emotional expressions regardless of internal state. By amplifying this expectation to an unnatural extreme, the narrative highlights discomfort associated with perceived lack of transparency in interpersonal communication. Urban settings often involve repeated exposure to individuals whose motivations remain unknown, creating opportunities for ambiguity to influence perception. The smiling man embodies this ambiguity by presenting a form that appears outwardly human, yet resists conventional interpretation. The inability to determine whether the figure represents genuine friendliness, intentional provocation, or simple coincidence contributes to the persistence of the story within contemporary folklore. Some interpretations suggest that the narrative resonates because it reflects broader concerns regarding unpredictability in environments where anonymity allows individuals to behave in ways less constrained by established social relationships. The presence of a stranger whose expression does not conform to expected emotional patterns may serve as a metaphor for uncertainty inherent in complex social systems. As with many modern legends, variations of the smiling man encounter have emerged through repeated retelling, introducing additional elements while preserving the core structure of the story. Some accounts describe the figure performing subtle gestures interpreted as invitations to approach, while others emphasize the absence of any attempt at communication. The persistence of the smile remains central across these variations, reinforcing its role as the defining feature responsible for generating discomfort. In certain versions, witnesses describe feeling compelled to maintain visual awareness of the figure despite a strong desire to avoid prolonged eye contact. This internal conflict illustrates the tension between curiosity and self-preservation that often characterizes encounters with ambiguous stimuli. The inability to categorize the situation as either clearly dangerous or entirely safe prolongs engagement, increasing the likelihood that the experience will be remembered and shared. The adaptability of the narrative contributes to its continued relevance within digital culture. Online platforms facilitate rapid dissemination of personal accounts, allowing individuals to compare experiences and identify recurring descriptive patterns. The resulting network of related stories reinforces the perception that the smiling man represents more than an isolated fictional creation, functioning instead as a collaborative expression of shared psychological sensitivity to subtle irregularities in human behavior. The enduring presence of the smiling man narrative demonstrates how contemporary folklore evolves through collective interpretation of ordinary experiences perceived as unusual due to contextual factors. Situations involving limited environmental stimulation, such as nighttime walks or quiet urban settings, increase the salience of minor deviations from expectation, encouraging reflection on possible explanations. Stories that emphasize ambiguity allow individuals to participate in interpretive processes without requiring definitive belief in supernatural causation. The smiling man exists within a conceptual space where psychological realism and narrative symbolism intersect, permitting engagement with themes related to perception, uncertainty, and the boundaries between familiarity and discomfort. The figure's simplicity contributes significantly to its memorability. Unlike elaborate mythological creatures requiring extensive descriptive detail, the smiling man can be represented through minimal narrative elements, enabling rapid transmission across communication channels. The accessibility of the concept ensures that the story remains adaptable to diverse contexts while preserving its essential emotional effect. The unsettling nature of the smiling man does not rely on overt displays of violence or transformation, but rather on the subtle disruption of expectations that typically govern social interaction. By presenting a figure that appears almost ordinary, yet behaves in ways that resist intuitive interpretation, the narrative captures a form of fear grounded in uncertainty rather than explicit threat. Stories such as this continue to resonate because they reflect cognitive processes involved in evaluating unfamiliar situations. The inability to determine intention with confidence encourages ongoing reflection, allowing the narrative to persist beyond the moment of initial exposure. Whether interpreted as symbolic expression or imaginative construction, the smiling man occupies a space within modern folklore defined by the recognition that discomfort often arises not from what is clearly dangerous, but from what cannot be easily understood. And perhaps that is why the story remains memorable, because the idea of encountering someone whose expression never changes challenges assumptions regarding emotional communication, leaving open the possibility that certain forms of strangeness can exist within ordinary environments without revealing themselves completely.
Next episode in Shadows of the South.
Unsettling, opening their door late at night, asking to be allowed inside, refusing, standing outside.